Welcome to Starbound, where every star tells a story. What happens when humanity, segregated from the natives on a foreign world, are finally released, and the native aliens must now confront the species that they fear? Let's get into the story. Astria shimmered like a jewel amidst the cosmic expanse, its domed cities teeming with 1,000 alien cultures. This vibrant intergalactic hub epitomized the galactic harmony that so many worlds strived for. That is, with one notable exception, the human dome. A stark gray expanse marring an otherwise pristine cityscape, it was both a relic and a grim reminder. To the Astrians, Zarelians, and the countless others who called this planet home, the humans symbolized a lingering echo of a violent past most preferred to forget. Jax couldn't erase those whispers of fear, not even this deep into his nightly maintenance rounds. The low thrum of the dome's archaic generators filled his ears, a mechanical heartbeat keeping a sleeping beast at bay. He'd never questioned the necessity of his work. It was just how things were. Humans were scary. Humans were destructive. Those were truths hammered into him since childhood. Yet, on nights like this, doubt nibbled at the edges of those certainties. His gaze settled on the control panel, a maze of faded dials and flickering indicators straight out of a history vid. How does one species manage to mess things up so spectacularly? He muttered. He blamed the persistent glitches plaguing the dome on humanity's inherently chaotic nature. A sharp beep jerked him back to the present. Fault detected. The words flashed ominously in deep crimson across the panel. Jax cursed, as Sector 4, the most densely populated area of the human settlement. His stomach twisted. If the system went haywire. Before he could fully comprehend the implications, a tremor ran through the dome. Red alert lights strobed, painting the sterile metal corridors in an urgent bloody hue. Then, a chilling silence fell. Jax froze. The emergency siren should be wailing, lockdown protocols activating. Instead, there was an eerie quiet, broken only by the insistent, panicked beeping of his console. Sector 4. Barrier failure. Imminent breach. Impossible. The system wasn't merely glitching. It was collapsing. His heart pounded a frantic rhythm. Warnings about catastrophic failure echoed in his head. Stories about what happens when humans broke free. Tales used by parents to scare misbehaving children. This wasn't a malfunction. It was a nightmare come to life. And somewhere on the other side of that now vanishing barrier were hundreds of humans, likely stirring into confused, dangerous wakefulness. The silence shattered first. What started as a muted rumble from within the dome transformed into a cacophony of shouts and metallic clanks that resonated through the chamber. It was a raw, primal sound, and the fear that had been a constant hum beneath Jax's skin now roared in his ears. Steeling himself, he ventured a step closer to the gaping hole where the barrier used to be. Smoke and faintly glowing dust motes hung in the air, stinging his eyes. Shapes were beginning to emerge. Hulking figures silhouetted against the faint light emanating from the human city within. Then a floodlight flickered on, casting harsh light and long, distorted shadows. Jax recoiled. They were so much bigger, their voices so much deeper than he imagined. A guttural roar echoed through the opening, followed by a surge of dark figures spilling out into Astrian territory. Jax's breath hitched. He expected a charge, weapons raised, the start of the rampage he'd always been told about. But instead there was chaos, disorientation. One of the imposing figures stumbled, nearly falling. From the depths of the smoke cloud, a high-pitched cry split the air. A child, maybe? He watched with his heart in his throat as a smaller figure darted forth, grabbing the larger one's hand with surprising strength. And right there, in front of him, was a human woman. Tall, yes, and broad-shouldered, but her face was twisted in a grimace of concern, not the bloodlust he'd expected. She looked afraid. Her eyes, impossibly blue, darted wildly, taking in the vast dome complex as if she couldn't comprehend it. "Jax," a voice crackled from his comm unit, and he jumped, startled. "Council Chambers is calling. Are you safe? What in the void is going on down there?" His hand fumbled with the communicator. I don't know," he admitted, his voice barely a whisper. "The barrier, it's collapsed. Sector 4. By the ancestors." His supervisor's voice held an edge of sheer terror. "Stay put, Jax. Security forces are mobilizing. Do not engage. I repeat, do not..." The transmission cut off abruptly. He was alone, surrounded by the monstrous humans of legend, but monsters didn't protect their young, did they? Monsters didn't have eyes that mirrored the confusion swirling in his own head. One of the figures, a hulking male with a face hardened into a scowl, caught sight of him. Jax tensed, ready for the attack that had to be coming. Instead, the man held up his enormous, calloused hands in a placating gesture, his voice surprisingly soft for such a huge creature. We don't mean any harm," the human rasped, his words halting as if he'd rarely used them. And somehow, despite the absurdity of the situation, Jax believed him. A voice cut through the tense silence, crisp and authoritative. "Jax, report!" He spun around to find a squad of Astrian security officers pushing through the debris, weapons raised. His relief quickly soured. "Here it comes." He braced himself. The Astrian captain, her scales iridescent blue in the strobing emergency lights, zeroed in on Jax. Then the human group huddled beyond. "Technician," she addressed him with clipped efficiency, "what is the meaning of this? Explain yourself." Jax opened his mouth, but the words stuck in his throat. How could he explain a system failure he barely understood? How could he admit to the flicker of doubt that had ignited in him, even before the barrier fell? Before he could fumble with an answer, the human who had spoken before stepped forward and raised his hands again, palms open. "Please," he said, his voice thick with an unfamiliar accent. "We came out, lights and noise, thought it was an attack." The security captain shifted her gaze to the human, her features tightening. "Attack? You thought you were under—" She scoffed, disbelief heavy in her tone. Turning back to Jax, she demanded, "Did you let them out on purpose?" "No," he blurted out, his voice finally finding its strength. "The barrier collapsed. The systems are failing. Silence," she barked, cutting him off. "Humans will return to their designated zone immediately." Her gaze swept over the confused crowd. "Use force if necessary." The human who had first spoken seemed to understand the words, even if the tone was lost on him. He stepped closer, a shadow of a pleading gesture hovering near his massive hand. "Wait, we can help. Something's wrong with the shield, the dome, whatever it is." He gestured at the sparking remains of the barrier mechanism. "I might be able to fix it." The captain looked at the human as though he'd sprouted a second head. "Fix it?" Her laugh was a sharp, humorless bark. "Humans are good at two things: breaking things and causing chaos. You'll fix nothing." Jax found himself bristling. These humans, lost and frightened as they were, weren't the savage horde he'd been taught to fear. He thought of the child, the way the woman had shielded them. It simply didn't match the image embedded in his mind. "Maybe," he spoke, surprised by the firmness in his own voice. "Maybe he's right. My readings show some kind of power surge right before the breach. If they caused it," he hesitated, "maybe they can undo the damage, too." The Astrian captain narrowed her eyes, a flicker of indecision dancing in their depths. It was a rare sight, Astrian authority so obviously challenged, yet there was a grim pragmatism that won out over ingrained prejudice. "Very well," she conceded with a curt nod. "Technician, supervise him. If this human so much as twitches wrong—" She trailed off, but the implicit threat was clear as day. Jax felt a surge of unease and an equally potent twinge of defiance. Nodding stiffly, he turned to the human, this unlikely engineer. "Show me what you've got," he said with forced bravado. The human, joined by a few others, moved to the wreckage of the barrier with surprising confidence. Their movements were deliberate, guided by whispers and murmurs Jax didn't fully understand. They prodded at charred wires, examined scorched consoles, a symphony of grunts and strange clipped words accompanying their work. A prickle of fear ran down his spine. These were the humans of galactic nightmare, the destroyers. But right now, their focus mirrored his own during his countless repair shifts. In this moment, they weren't so different after all. Suddenly, a woman pointed at one of the consoles. "Sarah, look," she exclaimed in that same strange tongue. Sarah. He hadn't known the woman's name before. Knelt by the sparking relic of technology, her brow furrowed in concentration. Whatever the others were seeing, it was enough to make her eyes widen with dawning comprehension. Before Jax could ask, Sarah was on her feet. "Overload," she said simply, one word that held an entire story of malfunction and mayhem. The system, it couldn't handle it. Jax felt his jaw drop. Overload. It was so obvious, so stupidly simple, and yet he hadn't even considered it. Sarah, this human woman, had just diagnosed their crisis in moments. The shame of it stung. "We can shut it down," she continued, urgency underscoring her words. "Reroute the flow." Sarah pointed towards a tangle of cables, her movements sure. Jax stammered, floundering for the right instructions, the right technical terms. This was his system, his responsibility, and he was being outclassed by someone who had barely set foot outside her designated prison. He could see the distrust flicker in the Astrian captain's eyes, the doubt mirrored in his own. But the alternative was bleak. To sit and watch the power grid surge further might doom not only the humans, but the Astrians nearby as well. "Do it," he finally said, his voice steadier than he felt. "Show me." A spark of recognition flickered in Sarah's eyes. It was slight, but for the first time Jax saw beyond the fear and prejudice. He saw something akin to gratitude? No. Perhaps it was simply a shared desperation. Whatever it was, it cemented his resolve. Sarah didn't waste time on empty thanks. She gestured for him to follow as she knelt beside the mangled cables, a battered toolkit appearing in her hand. The tools were like nothing Jax had seen, crude but undeniably functional, with a kind of rough-hewn ingenuity that echoed in her focused expression. "Here," she said, pointing at a cluster of wires that had fused with alarming heat. "Cut. Now." Jax hesitated for a split second, then snatched a pair of cutters from his own belt. He'd severed these wires 100 times before, but never with a human's life, and potentially the lives of everyone in range of a catastrophic energy surge, depending on his actions. With a deep breath, he snipped cleanly. The wires sparked, and then fell lifeless. Sarah didn't pause. Moving with surprising agility for her size, she reached into the heart of the panel. He could do nothing but watch. A strange sort of student to his supposed captive. "Bypass," she muttered, her brow furrowed with intense focus. "Redirect. There." Jax felt a surge of hope. He hadn't completely understood the first time, but he understood now. Sarah was building a detour within the system, diverting power around the damaged sector, a bold but brilliant workaround. He should have thought of it, he who'd memorized these schematics since his earliest training. The other humans had gathered around. They weren't merely watching Sarah work, they were adapting their movements to hers, handing her tools, clearing debris, each a cog in a strange machine that Jax still struggled to fully comprehend. This was teamwork, not violence, a desperate collaborative dance to stave off disaster. It took an agonizingly long time. Every second stretched into a yawning eternity. Finally, Sarah withdrew her hands, a faint sheen of grease and soot marring her face. Her eyes, those startlingly blue eyes, met his with a mixture of exhaustion and something he dared to call hope. "Try it," she said simply. Jax rushed to the main control panel. With trembling fingers, he flicked the activation switch. A pregnant silence fell, then a faint hum that slowly built into the comforting thrumming pulse of a well-functioning energy system. Jax let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. Then he turned and slowly, deliberately looked at the gathered humans. The captain met his gaze, her hard stare softening just a fraction, and all around in the weary but hopeful faces of the supposed monsters, Jax saw not a reflection of fear, but the stark silhouette of heroes. News of Sarah's quick thinking rippled through the dome complex like a shockwave. The first wave was pure disbelief. Humans, fixing Astrian technology. It was so wrong, so against the grain of everything they'd been taught, it threatened to crack the very foundations of societal belief. The second wave, Jax noticed, was curiosity. Astrians, Israelians, even a cluster of usually aloof Zindari cautiously approached the area, still keeping a safe distance, but their eyes were wide with a fascinated, almost reluctant respect. The security captain, despite her grudging acceptance, kept her troops tightly arrayed around the humans like a protective shell. Jax could practically feel the questions simmering in her mind, the mental struggle between ingrained prejudice and the hard truth of the situation they'd faced. He approached her, a newfound confidence in his step. They need to get back into the dome. He was no longer asking permission, he was stating a fact. The power grid could surge again. Sarah is the only one who seems to understand it. The captain's jaw clenched tight. Even if that's true, she said, voice low, they can't stay here. It's too much of a risk. Then where? Jax challenged, the desperation in his voice echoing the collective worry he was starting to sense from the Astrians around him. Leave the system compromised? Wait for another breach that no one knows how to fix? Sarah is a risk, he admitted, but right now, she's the only solution we have. The captain looked at the humans, at Sarah, who was deep in discussion with her fellow engineers, her focus now unwavering on the task at hand. For a long moment, she battled the tide of everything she'd been taught, everything she believed. Finally, in a voice rough with concession, she said, "They go back inside, under very strict guard." Her eyes met Jax's. "And you, technician, you will answer for this." Jax nodded once, grim but resolved. He'd been ready for consequences the moment he started to trust the word of a supposed monster over his own ingrained beliefs. It was a price he was willing to pay to ensure safety, to ensure a chance to challenge the very foundations of a world teetering precariously on the brink of a monumental shift. As the humans, Sarah leading the way, walked back to the now flickering gateway into the dome, a ripple of whispers spread through the Astrian crowd. It wasn't the harsh whisper of fear anymore, but something different. Something filled with uncertainty and perhaps a sliver of hope. Jax couldn't help but think that with change often came discomfort, and right now the galaxy's most notorious species was delivering a healthy dose of both. Inside the dome, the air was thick with tension. The humans moved cautiously, their previous disorientation replaced with grim determination under the watchful eyes of double the usual guard detail. Sarah headed straight for the smoking remnants of the barrier, a small crowd of her fellow engineers falling in line behind her. Jax trailed after them, his mind buzzing. The images of the past few hours kept replaying. The fear, the initial conflict, the begrudging cooperation, and Sarah, always Sarah, a human who was both utterly alien and somehow frustratingly familiar. Reaching the damaged barrier, Sarah signaled for the others to spread out. They didn't question her, this unlikely leader who had emerged from the shadows of fear. They moved in tandem with her, their focus mirroring the urgency that was now gnawing at Jax. The dome system, their precious safety net, was still a ticking time bomb, and that responsibility rested heavy on his shoulders. Heavier now that he knew a human was the lifeline he desperately clung to. While Sarah and her team scrutinized the charred remnants, he pulled up the status reports on his datapad. Initial stabilization was holding, but there were anomalies cropping up. Fluctuations in the power grid, odd surges that spiked, then disappeared. "Sarah," he called out, unable to mask the tension in his voice, "I'm seeing fluctuations. Whatever you did, it's holding." Sarah turned, smudges of grime marring her pale face. She was tired, he realized, but her blue eyes still held that piercing intelligence that had shaken his worldview. "I expected as much," she admitted. "This workaround, it's like slapping a bandage on a broken limb. It'll buy us time, but the whole system needs a proper overhaul. And for that," she trailed off, glancing around, "I'll need access to everything." A wave of unease rippled through the Astrian onlookers. Access to the core systems that controlled not only the dome, but communications, environmental regulation, everything that kept their world running smoothly. Jax felt it too. To give a human this level of control, it went against everything he knew. Yet, he also knew, with painful certainty, that he didn't have the expertise for this. His pride prickled, but logic won out. "We'll need approval, security clearances, high-level counsel." He started to list the bureaucratic hoops, anything to buy time, to soften the blow. Sarah interrupted him with a brusque nod. "I get it. I'm not expecting a blank check, but the clock is ticking, Jax. You know it as well as I do." He did. And with growing dread, he realized he wasn't simply worried about the power grid anymore. It was about the tenuous trust starting to form, the fragile chance they had to bridge the gulf between human and Astrian. If the system failed again, if disaster struck and it was blamed on Sarah, that sliver of possibility would vanish like dust on a solar wind. Jax found himself standing outside the towering council chambers, the center of Astrian power. It was a place he'd only glimpsed a handful of times, and always as a lowly technician called to fix minor malfunctions. Never like this, with his future, and perhaps the future of his entire world hanging in the balance. He wasn't alone. Two security officers flanked him, and beyond them stood Sarah, a formidable human figurehead amid the swirling mass of Astrians bustling through the grand atrium. He was struck by how many eyes followed her, eyes still filled with suspicion, but now laced with a potent, undeniable curiosity. The whispers that had followed them from the dome had reached the heart of the city, and they rippled through the crowd like eddies in a stream. When the council doors finally opened, the vast circular chamber within seemed to swallow them whole. Dozens of Astrians of the highest status, their scales shimmering with colors denoting their respective houses and roles, looked up with varying degrees of disdain. Jax had never felt smaller, nor more determined. "Technician, explain yourself," boomed the voice of the elder counselor, a sound that resonated with ancestral authority. It was time. He outlined the events at the dome, leaving nothing out. The initial terror of the barrier breach, Sarah's quick assessment, the jerry-rigged workaround. His words hung in the silent chamber as he laid bare the gamble he had taken. "And so you propose," the elder counselor paused for dramatic effect, "that we place our entire world's fate in the hands of a human of all creatures." His tone dripped with disdain. Murmurs of agreement rippled through the chamber. Jax could feel the fragile trust he'd built with Sarah starting to crumble. One wrong word and the chance he saw would be buried beneath an avalanche of deeply ingrained fear. He braced himself. "With respect, Elder Counselor, we have no other option. The barrier could falter again at any moment. Sarah and her people are the only ones who understand it enough to prevent another, or worse. It is not about trust," Jax continued, finding his voice strengthening, "but about necessity." A younger counselor, one Jax knew was a proponent of interspecies collaboration, leaned forward. "The technician speaks the truth. We have exhausted our own expertise. Prolonging this decision only brings us closer to disaster." A heated debate erupted. Voices rose, accusations swirling along with pragmatic arguments. Jax watched Sarah's face. She stood stoic, but he saw the slight clench of her jaw, the tension beneath her cool exterior. She was far from the monstrous caricature of her species, but would that be enough to sway a council so deeply rooted in tradition? After what felt like an eternity, the elder counselor raised a clawed hand, bringing a heavy silence down upon the chamber. "Very well." His voice was laced with reluctance, but held an unwavering resolve. "The human Sarah will be granted limited access under constant supervision. You, Technician Jax, will bear full responsibility for her actions." Relief, tinged with a deep sense of responsibility, surged through Jax. They had won this battle, perhaps just the first of many. Turning towards the door, he motioned for Sarah to follow. The game was far from over, but as he watched her determined stride, a strange emotion welled up in his chest, something akin to the defiant stirrings of hope. Sarah didn't waste time with pleasantries. As soon as they were back within the dome, she beelined towards the makeshift command center that had been erected near the breach. Astrian engineers and security personnel parted nervously before her, the fear now mixed with begrudging respect. Jax handed her a datapad loaded with system schematics and up-to-the-minute readings. She barely spared it a glance, her eyes already roving across a jumbled mess of consoles and cabling. He had prided himself on keeping this area neat, but the recent chaos had transformed it into a nightmare of tangled wires and blinking lights. Yet, within this chaos, Sarah seemed to find an odd kind of order. "We need to isolate sections," she barked, already directing the stunned Astrian technicians. "I need complete control over power distribution, shutdowns, rerouting, everything." Her voice was a commanding thrum, vibrating with an urgency that pushed aside any remaining hesitation. She turned to him, a fierce intensity in her blue eyes. "Jax, I know how your systems work, in theory, but they're antiquated, patched 100 times over. I need to understand the deviations, where you've diverted power, where the redundancies are failing." It was less a request and more a demand. Jax had no illusions, the roles had reversed. He was now the student, scrambling to keep pace with the formidable intellect before him. And yet, it wasn't an entirely unpleasant realization. Over the next grueling hours, Sarah became the eye of a storm. She analyzed readings, rewrote code, barking orders in a mix of her own language and surprisingly proficient Astrian technical jargon. Sweat mingled with grime on her face, but her focus was unwavering. Jax was her shadow, translating protocols, fetching tools, a constant whirlwind of activity fueled by sheer adrenaline. And as he moved, he observed. The humans, at first so foreign, began to take shape in his mind. There was the older, burly engineer who always seemed to be in the right spot, offering a spare part or a steadying hand without a word. The younger one, her fingers a blur across a datapad, rerouting signals and muttering formulas that made Jax's head spin. They moved in sync, an ebb and flow guided not by strict order, but by a strange, unspoken understanding. It was both unsettling and undeniably effective. Then a system failure, a critical power node overloading, threatening to take down a whole sector. Sarah swore, a harsh word in that strange guttural tongue of hers. But there was no panic, only quick, decisive action. "Isolate!" she commanded, and the team reacted instantly. Sections dimmed, the overloading whine of the power node fading slowly, replaced by a chorus of relieved sighs. She'd averted another crisis. Again. As another day turned to night, as exhaustion seeped into his bones, Jax knew a shift had occurred. They were no longer enemies, bound by tentative trust. They were collaborators, a jumbled mix of species battling a common foe, a fragile system teetering on the edge of collapse. In the fight for survival, those old labels of human and Astrian began to fade, replaced by the simple truth of beings desperately trying to save their world. Word of Sarah's relentless effort began to spread. It started as muttered whispers among the guards, then spilled like wildfire through the dome, filtering beyond its confines like an unbidden signal. While she worked, surrounded by those flickering monitors and that mess of cables, Sarah was unknowingly becoming a symbol. It manifested in small gestures at first. A food ration quietly left outside the command center, an extra blanket for those pulling endless shifts. The wary glances became less frequent, replaced by furtive curiosity. Jax noticed the change when a young Zrelian engineer hesitantly approached, datapad in hand. I reran the stress calculations on subsector 3, she stammered, extending the device towards him. I think there's a way to offload some of the strain, if your human engineer approves. He took the datapad, his heart swelling just a bit. Sarah, look, he said, unable to completely hide the pride in his voice. She glanced up with a frown, exhaustion etching dark circles beneath those fierce eyes. But as she took the datapad, scanned the calculations, a flicker of something akin to surprise danced across her face. This could work, she admitted, a hint of grudging admiration in her tone. It's unorthodox, she continued, her innate drive to analyze already taking over. But the numbers check out. Run it by system control, see if they can handle the switch. The Zrelian beamed, a sight so unusual that it startled a laugh out of Jax. The two of them, Astrian and human, bent over the schematics, discussing adjustments and fail-safes. They were a picture of normalcy in this world turned upside down, and it brought an unexpected pang of hope. It was no grand gesture, no sudden epiphany of interspecies brotherhood, but it was a start, a testament that even amidst the tension, even amidst the fear that still clawed beneath the surface, there were cracks where understanding could grow. As days melted into a blur, Sarah and her team became a fixture in the command center. They developed a strange routine, bursts of manic activity interspersed with periods of tense waiting, snatch moments of rest fueled by energy rations and the sheer determination to keep the dome and the city inside it from crumbling. The humans had even taken to calling Jax by name, the syllables still a bit clumsy on their tongues, but the effort was endearing, and against all odds, he found himself returning the gesture. There was Sarah, of course, the undisputed leader, but also Ben with his quiet efficiency and surprising humor, and Lara whose quick mind seemed to run on adrenaline alone. They were no longer just humans. They were individuals, bound together by a bizarre twist of fate and their own tenacious spirit. News of the humans' progress traveled on wings of desperation and hope. It reached the ears of the elder counselor, carried not by official channels, but by the hushed conversations in bustling markets and tense whispers in the grand halls of power. It was inevitable, then, that the elder counselor himself would arrive at the dome, not with the pomp and circumstance of his previous visit, but with the quiet, scrutinizing demeanor of a predator cautiously approaching its prey. Jax and Sarah met him beside a wall of monitors, data streaming across the screens faster than any eye could process. "I hear you've managed to stabilize the barrier," the elder counselor acknowledged. He moved as if every step measured the danger in front of him, his gaze flicking between Sarah and Jax. "A temporary measure, I assume?" "Temporary," Sarah agreed, then gestured at the complex readings displayed across the screens. "But it gives us time. Time to identify the root cause of the failure. Time to implement a permanent solution. Or time to orchestrate your escape," the counselor countered, his voice dripping with suspicion. Sarah met his gaze unflinchingly. "And where would we escape to, elder counselor? Back outside the dome, to face the hostile world that has labeled us monsters? My people want to survive, yes, but here, within this dome, is our best chance." It was a bold declaration, laced with both pragmatism and a hint of defiance. Jax felt his heart beat a little faster. It was a truth he'd barely dared to acknowledge, but now, spoken aloud, it hung heavy in the air, undeniable. The elder counselor stood, the scales on his face shifting with an unreadable emotion. He scrutinized Sarah for a long moment, then turned his gaze upon Jax. "The safety of Astria rests on your shoulders, technician. Do not fail us." With those ominous words, he turned and disappeared back into the anonymity of the crowd. As the counselor's presence faded, Sarah exhaled sharply. She'd passed some unspoken test, but both she and Jax knew the true balance of power had yet to fully shift. They were still fighting for acceptance. One stabilized system, one successful repair at a time. "Another day, another challenge," Sarah said wryly, turning back to the bank of monitors. "Let's figure out what's stressing Subsector 5. I have a feeling we haven't seen the last malfunction from that part of the grid." With a shared sigh that was equal parts exhaustion and determination, they dove back into the labyrinth of wires and data. There was no time for celebration, no chance to dwell on victories. After all, the hard truth remained. They weren't just fixing a dome. They were attempting to fix a broken world, one tense interaction at a time. As days turned into weeks, the dome transformed. Humans and Astrians shared cramped workspaces, their figures hunched over terminals, their voices a murmur of shared terminology. It was a bizarre and beautiful mess, the chaos of wires and the hum of machinery, punctuated by bursts of laughter as a translation hiccup sparked unexpected humor. The changes spread beyond the repair site. Rumors morphed into curiosity, and eventually, boldness. An Astrian child, eyes wide, cautiously approached the team's makeshift mess hall, bearing a small, misshapen pastry. A group of Zrelians, with their iridescent scales gleaming beneath the dome's artificial sun, requested a guided tour through the inner workings of the human sector. These weren't monumental leaps, not declarations of intergalactic peace. They were simply human touchpoints in a world that had always denied their existence. And with each shared smile, each hesitant question carefully answered, the chasm between human and other seemed to shrink ever so slightly. Jax saw it in his fellow Astrians. The fear that had gripped them was slowly fading, giving way to fascination and even a kind of cautious respect. The old slurs were spoken less frequently. The glances filled more with curiosity than contempt. He felt it in himself, too. The humans, despite their strange ways and rough exterior, were not the boogeymen of his childhood. Sarah, of course, remained the focal point of this transition. Her reputation spread beyond the dome. In the city proper, in hushed whispers at first, then with growing boldness, they spoke of Sarah the engineer, Sarah the lifesaver. The title felt strange and wondrous in its simplicity. Not Sarah the human, but simply Sarah, a person defined by her actions, not her species. One evening, as Jax was snatching a few precious hours of sleep, he was awoken by a commotion in the corridor. Groggy and disoriented, he stumbled to the door to find a crowd gathered just beyond the command center. Astrians, Zrelians, even a few of the reclusive Zindari. They weren't chanting demands or raising fists, but rather stood in a circle, staring intently at the center. Pushing his way through, Jack saw Sarah kneeling beside a young Astrian child. His leg was crudely bandaged, a makeshift splint lashed in place. Sarah spoke softly, her voice low and soothing despite the child's sobs. "It will be okay," she promised, her words somehow gentle and forceful at the same time. "They'll make you better, stronger." The child had fallen in the chaos of construction, injuring himself in a world still littered with the hazardous tools of change. And it was Sarah, once the object of fear, who offered the first true gesture of comfort. As Jax watched the child calm under her touch, he felt a shift, not only within the dome, but within his own heart. The lines he so carefully adhered to, those that separated him from them, were no longer drawn in stone, but in shifting sand. The day the barrier fell, the day the unthinkable happened, was not a single event swallowed by time. It was a catalyst, the first brushstroke in a painting that was nowhere near completion. Sarah, no longer a prisoner but a cornerstone of their survival, couldn't be sequestered back to obscurity. Her knowledge, her skills, were too valuable. But so too were her differences. It began with subtle shifts. Small living quarters within the dome, once designated for emergency use by Astrians, were hesitantly cleared out for a handful of human engineers. It wasn't luxury, but offered a modicum of privacy, a separation from the constant scrutiny. Meals, once standardized rations, were adapted with surprising care to accommodate strange human dietary needs. Concessions accompanied by both a sigh of inconvenience and a spark of fascination. Then came the questions. At first, tentative inquiries whispered to Jax about the world beyond the dome, a world he himself had only ever feared. He'd answer as best he could, painting incomplete pictures with words of harsh landscapes and brutal wars that had shaped his understanding. The questions grew bolder, turning inwards. What did Sarah and her people dream of? How did they play? Did they mourn the way Astrians did? Jax fielded these questions, awkwardly at first, then with the growing confidence of a bridge builder. He realized these weren't tests of loyalty, but attempts at understanding. Perhaps for the first time, others truly wanted to see beyond the label of human, recognizing that fear came not from true monstrosity, but from simple unfamiliarity. The changes rippled outward. Humans, faces once hidden behind a homogeneous mask of fear, were now asked their names, offered small gestures of respect, a tilt of the head, a shared meal. It was a far cry from true equality, but the rigid structure of prejudice was being pried open, one hesitant interaction at a time. The elder counselor, ever the pragmatist, saw the undeniable benefit of collaboration and grudgingly began to adapt. Policies were rewritten, concessions granted, always laced with caution and a healthy dose of suspicion, but moving inexorably toward a future where the humans weren't merely tolerated, but tentatively integrated. Sarah, the catalyst of this upheaval, remained the most curious of contradictions. She held herself apart, driven by a relentless focus on fixing the dome, fixing their world. Yet, she couldn't shut herself off entirely. In moments of rest, Jax would catch her watching Astrian children at play, her blue eyes filled with a strange, wistful longing. Did she miss a world denied her, something gentler than her harsh reality? He yearned to ask, but the question felt too bold, too invasive. Then one day, as they pored over a particularly stubborn schematic, she muttered, "We never let them play with the old tech. Too dangerous." The we hung heavy between them. "They miss it, I think," she continued, lost in thought. "The tinkering, the making things from scrap, that's how we learn." Jax felt his world expand just another fraction. Humans weren't just about violence and chaos. They too yearned for creation, for childhoods not marred by constant vigilance. And in that moment, across the battered workbench, he felt a flicker of kinship, a recognition that no matter how different their worlds had been, some fundamental truths were undeniably universal. Time warped within the microcosm of the dome. Days were measured not in sunrise and sunset, but in averted power failures, in systems brought back from the brink. It was a relentless grinding process, but progress was undeniable, and progress brought change, whether Astria was truly ready or not. The dome, once a prison, morphed into an unlikely sanctuary. The fear faded further, replaced by a tense camaraderie built of shared meals, hastily eaten, whispered jokes across language barriers, and the ever-present knowledge that their survival depended on each other. Sarah, the unlikely hero, found herself thrust into a leadership role she didn't seek, but accepted with quiet stoicism. She led by example, by tireless work alongside her team, but also by an odd pragmatism Jax found both frustrating and effective. Humans were, apparently, ruthlessly efficient in crisis. He watched her negotiate with an Astrian overseer for a shipment of spare parts, her sharp words laced with unexpected diplomacy. He saw her mediate a dispute between an overworked technician and a stubborn Zarelian engineer, effortlessly bridging the cultural divide despite the lingering distrust from both sides. There was a fire in Sarah, a protective streak that extended beyond her own species, that demanded a better world not through grand gestures, but stone by stone. And there were the moments in between, the lulls in the chaos. One evening, finding himself curiously drawn, Jax ventured hesitantly into the makeshift human quarters. To his surprise, the utilitarian space was transformed. Small, flickering lights, a clever feat of human engineering, cast long shadows that danced on the walls. Sarah was sitting cross-legged on the floor, surrounded by a small group of human children. Her stern demeanor had softened, her voice barely above a whisper as she told a story, her hands moving with surprising expressiveness. Jax couldn't understand the words, but the tone was unmistakable. Tales of wonder, of adventure. The children listened with rapt attention, eyes wide. It was a scene of such startling tenderness, a glimpse into a world he'd been taught didn't exist for humans. Not gentleness, not warmth, just calculated survival. Yet here he was, witnessing a bond as old as time, one born not of species, but of shared stories, shared hopes. Without realizing, he'd stepped closer, drawn in by the soft glow of the lights and the spellbinding hum of Sarah's voice. A child noticed him, her eyes widening in alarm before curiosity took over. She tugged on Sarah's sleeve and whispered something, too low for Jax to understand. Sarah paused her story, and her gaze landed on him. The easy smile of moments before vanished, replaced by her customary guarded expression. He felt an unwelcome chill, a stark reminder that he was still the outsider, the Astrian. Would she ask him to leave, to retreat back into the world of systems and wires and safe distance? But then, Sarah did something unexpected. She patted the space beside her, the gesture unmistakably clear. An invitation. Hesitantly, Jax lowered himself to the floor. The children watched him with wary fascination, shifting closer. He held his breath, unsure, and then slowly, he started to truly listen. Not to Sarah's words, which were a language foreign to him, but to the rhythm of her voice, the way smiles flickered across the children's faces. In that simple act of shared storytelling, he found, if not belonging, something close to understanding. Maybe this was what the start of a new world looked like.